Good. Hello, everyone. So many people are tuning in, and I'm so excited. We are going to have hopefully a very rich and fruitful discussion. And we have two wonderful discussants here from chemistry and biology. So we have Melanie Cooper, professor of science education and chemistry at Michigan State, and then Ross Nehm, professor of ecology and evolution and science education at Stony Brook University. We are increasingly realizing the value of hearing from different disciplines. So thank you for representing biology today. Let me tell you a little bit about how the discussion is going to go. We have some big questions about assessment. Hence the vague cracking open the box. So we want to just start thinking about these big questions together. We're going to allocate about 15 minutes to each of these big questions. But we're going to restrict your individual talking points to 2-ish minutes. At 30 seconds left, you're going to see some jazz hands from me. And then a big X when you need to stop talking. Okay, that's the plan. And then I also wanted, we're in a weird time that's requiring a lot of us to go remote, right? So I'm hoping to have you all weave that throughout your discussion, a consideration, or what are the considerations we have in taking our assessment. Modifying it for remote learning. To all of these participants, thank you for being here. We are going to have explicitly space for you all to ask questions, and we can do that in a couple ways. So if you want to write questions as you're thinking of them into the chat, then when we pause in between these big questions, we will try to get those questions voiced. If you're feeling very brave, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask that question in the webinar. So both of those will be available to you, and use them as much. We want to hear all of your questions. So I think we're gonna get started. Okay, big question. What do we think in chemistry and biology is worth assessing? And let's start with you, Melanie.
Okay, that is a big question. And I think I'm going to lead with this famous quote that I don't know who said it, but it's so apt, which is, if you don't assess what's important, what's assessed becomes important. And I think that we have gone a little way too far, perhaps, down that road, assessing what is easy rather than what is important. And of course, what's important depends upon who you are and what your goals are, whether you're assessing. I think most of us here are not talking about programmatic assessment, and that's certainly not my expertise, but what I'm going to focus more on is, I'm sorry, we have workers outside and apparently they've chosen now to talk. My apologies. So what's important? Well, it depends what you think, what science is, right? What's science? And to me, science, the task of science is to explain observations and to make testable predictions. And yet we very, very rarely ask these kinds of questions of students. What we do instead, and I don't want to belabor this too much, but I do believe that we've become restricted by sometimes by the technology. And I believe that we have spent a lot of time on changing our pedagogy without changing our approach to assessment. So I haven't actually got round to what is important. So what is important is, I think we want to help students develop a more expert-like understanding of science, and for us in chemistry, and across the disciplines.
Ross, can you speak to that from your background?
Sure. I agree with what Melanie's talking about, and I think, in fact, the ways in which we are conceptualizing science in higher education is about to be changed really dramatically in the next decade because of this increasing emphasis in high schools on these practices of science, these engaging and authentic ways that people understand the natural world. As scientists, we engage in lots of argumentation. We try to explain things, we build models, and this very active, engaging, collaborative nature of science, because of the next generation science standards, high school students are going to be coming to college saying, I have a better understanding what science is. And they're going to arrive in a chemistry class or an intro bio class and potentially be asked to memorize lots of small pieces of information versus doing these practices that basically are designed to be authentic in the sense that they work together. We weave together aspects of our disciplinary knowledge with our actions to generate understanding about something. And that active, integrative, collaborative nature is going to need to inform what we assess in higher education. So I think, as Melanie said, the nature of science is increasingly going to be central to what we look for in student understanding.
I wonder if you all could dive into some specifics from your disciplines about what this looks like.
So, so from chemistry, I think, and I don't want to focus just on practices, because there are other aspects to learning, obviously. But but let me just give you an example that made me realize that I had gone down the wrong path for many, many years. So I used to love questions about structure and properties, which is a core idea in chemistry, however you want to look at it. And we would ask students, you know, which of these two compounds has the highest boiling point? And the students would say, oh, that one because it's got hydrogen bonding. And we could ask this in multiple choice, or we could ask this in a you know, a short answer, and we would get the right answer, and everybody was happy, and we patted ourselves on the back. But what happened was we started to ask students more three-dimensional questions. That is, we asked students to draw a representation of what they meant by boiling and what they meant by hydrogen bonding, and to explain in terms of forces and energy what was going on. And the first thing that we saw was that the vast majority of our students, who were really doing very well, this was not their fault. They scored in the 70-odd percentile on the ACS standardized exam. But they drew hydrogen bonding as within molecules. And so when we told them that when ethanol or water boils, and we tell them that it breaks the hydrogen bonds, it's not really any wonder that these students are seeing the molecules break apart. So the very nature of our assessments was leading us completely down the wrong path. We were quite convinced that our students knew what they were talking about until we started to ask these deeper questions where students had to go in and explain and construct a model and use those to predict what would happen, and to give a fuller, more detailed, more connected explanation of what was going on.
Ross, do you have a similar experience that transitioned how you think about assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think this three-dimensional concept of learning about disciplinary core ideas, it is a really deep aspects of our disciplinary identities, the way we organize information, the way we make sense of the myriad facts that we're confronted with every day, and how we integrate and organize those to perform functions, practical functions as a scientist, that is to make a prediction that actually functions, to build a model that accounts for things that we can't actually see, that builds understanding. These aspects are not currently emphasized in our assessments. And of course, disciplinary core ideas are emphasized to some extent. But currently, we have, as people say, we have everything is a mile wide and an inch deep. We have endless factoids and small fragments that are just scattered across a landscape that students cannot traverse with any success. And so the fundamental aspects of this geography of thought within a discipline really needs to be identified. In the life sciences, we have vision and change, which chemists should definitely be familiar with, given that most students, I believe this is correct, in chemistry classrooms are life science students. And BioCore, which is another important document that operationalizes the conceptual ideas within vision and change, are crucial tools. And so, as Melanie said, the disciplinary core ideas, these fundamental units that we need to focus on in greater depth, combined with practices, are what we need to be focusing on as educators in higher education.
So Melanie, you shook your head at the assertion that we're kind of doing disciplinary core ideas.
I did. And it
may
may
flesh out this.
Yes, of course I can. It may be different in biology, but so we developed a protocol called the 3D lab. And we actually, we didn't use the disciplinary core ideas from the framework because they're meant for K-12. And we had, we collaborated with lots of people and decided on core ideas for chemistry and biology and for physics at MSU. And we used this 3D lab, and what we did was we looked at the exams, and never mind the practices, most of them didn't have any core ideas in them either. And I'll give you an explanation. I'll give you an example of what I mean. So a big core idea is forces. You know, we modify it for chemistry and bonding and interactions, but this idea that things attract each other or repel each other. And, but if you look at the way this plays out in chemistry, for example, it's buried down in bond energies. If you look at the ACS curriculum map, for example, forces and I think bonding and interaction, something is up here. And down at the level where they suggest that you test is bond energies and doing bond energy calculations. Now, you can do a bond energy calculation without ever understanding that it takes energy to break a bond. And that's what I'm talking about. So we have, and just like you said, Ross, our traditional exams are full of fragmentary activities, tasks, skills, facts, you know, rote problems, but they're not connected in chemistry. Usually not connected back to the core ideas. And what that means is that students' knowledge is not becoming connected like experts is. And so when we ask them in the next class to use that knowledge, they can't do it because it was only used in this one small situation. It's not connected to a more expert-like framework. That's what I meant. And I'm sure it's different in biology.
What are some of the differences in biology? How do you all treat your disciplinary core ideas?
Well, the life sciences, I think, have had a challenge for the past century of trying to unite disciplines, given that in most universities, there's many biology departments. In fact, some will go so far as to say there is no such thing as biology. There are different epistemic frames and goals that different disciplines have, and they've organized in different departments. It may be by the organism you study. In some universities, you have zoology departments and biology departments and microbiology departments. In others, you have departments organized by biological scale, others organized by concept, for example, ecology and evolution. And so a major challenge for the field that continues to exist is how to unite all of the continuing continuing pace of discovery across all these disciplines. How do you unite this into a framework that makes sense for students when all of the scientists teaching them are typically working under fundamentally different sets of conditions, contexts, and orientations? But the field, I think, through Vision and Change and BioCore and assessments associated with those like biomaps, the field is beginning to coalesce on an assessment identity. What I mean by that is there is beginning to emerge a consensus about what it is that all of our disciplines collectively are looking for. We're beginning to establish that. But the disciplinary fragmentation of science is something that is only going to increase. And it is a force working against unification of pursuits relating to assessments. But excellent progress has been made in biology, I think, over the past 10 years.
So we are getting some excellent questions in the chat. So I want to open it up to attendees if you're brave enough to raise your hand. But I'm going to start with a question about how we achieve balance in assessments with these important pieces that you all mentioned. Particularly, is there value in testing for the facts that you all mentioned? Oh, go ahead.
So, of course, students have to know things. They can't construct an explanation if they don't know things. But assessments send a really strong implicit message about what's important. And if we only test for facts, we only test for rote problem solving or skills, without ever asking them to use their knowledge in the context of the scientific practices, well, however we want to characterize that, then I think we're doing our students a huge disservice. But I don't think anybody's saying that they should be using the practices in a vacuum. They need to know things, and yeah, so yes. That's the answer, but not to the extent that we do now, I think, in general.
And then, Ross, you brought up the NGSS and how that affects incoming students. Do we have any sense of how actually widespread NGSS adoption is, and when we're going to start observing the kinds of changes in incoming students that you described?
Well, that is a great question. There's always lots of policy documents and plans, but the realization of those goals is often a decade beyond the instantiation of the ideas. So NGS adoption is happening. In terms of the number of states could be one benchmark of its adoption. But interestingly enough, relating to our discussion here today, the greatest challenge to NGSS implementation, I think, will relate to the ability to assess three-dimensional learning. Many projects exist that have been working to develop assessments on the intersection of argumentation and disciplinary core ideas and explanation and other ideas. But without widespread availability of easy to use and easy to understand assessments for these topics, I think we're going to have limited implementation. So we're early on the journey, but discussions are beginning with professional development throughout the United States, where teachers are being introduced to these ideas, and they are slowly going to be in our classrooms. And will we be ready?
Great. I have one more question. It's chemistry specific. Sorry for being exclusive. Do you think that we are going to have to change some of the standardized assessments like the ACS exams that we have in chemistry to better align with what you all voiced as worth assessing?
Yes. There's a tension here, right? The ACS exams have a very particular focus and certainly they need to have very good psychometric properties. So you don't want the test items to show differential item functioning. You don't want to disenfranchise some students. But that being said, I think that, yes, I think it is more difficult to make these more complex, tests where there's levels of understanding rather than yes, no. Every test, every ACS test is a multiple choice and it's yes, no. How do we assess student explanations? And I think both Ross and I have been associated with a project where we're talking about automatically grading those kinds of things. So the ACER project, automatic assessment of constructed response. And I know that Ross has done a huge amount of work in this area. And we've done a little where we can look at the level of student responses. So we can have students write an explanation or an argument and then look at the quality of what they're writing. And we've found that it's as good as people grading it. And I know Ross has published a good bit on this as well. If you'd like to say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the revolution in assessment that has started is leveraging machine learning, which is transforming every aspect of our world. Every time we shop on Amazon to Netflix giving us movie recommendations, machine learning is in the substrate now of the technological infrastructure, for better or for worse. Educators have been very slow to leverage this technology, but the analysis of text using machine learning methodologies is widespread around the world. The ACER project, as Melanie mentioned, is a great example of that. The use of machine learning to replace people doing this really laborious task of scoring and spending more time thinking about student thinking, which is the ultimate goal of assessment, in my mind, is to really understand how students think so that we as instructors can foster progress in that area. And so the website is beyondmultiplechoice.org. And there are many assessments that are free for use that can be auto-scored in chemistry and biology. And so I encourage you to look at that. I think the project is remarkable in that it's new. And in the future, we're going to see quite amazing products come out using machine learning. If possible, I'd like to say one thing about the issue of assessing facts that ties in a little bit to equity and diversity issues, which are on many of our minds given the COVID situation. And that is, when we assess a lot of facts, it turns out that students who have much more privileged backgrounds tend to have a larger bank of facts that they have had the privilege of memorizing over the years. And so downplaying facts can also be a way to more equitably engage students in science through phenomena that everyone is experiencing in a novel way. It levels the playing field and allows someone to actually engage with something in a little bit more of a, I guess in a more equal way. So the the amount of stored knowledge that someone has is often associated with privilege. And so a challenge for all of us as educators is how do we try to address that elephant in the room when it comes to assessment and education?
So I actually, one of our attendees brought up a really wonderful question, which is that they have students who are coming from schools that maybe overemphasized rote memorization and then exhibit discomfort surrounding these kinds of assessments. So can you speak to that from an equity perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the lack of, I think, equity-based grading in schools, and what I mean by that is the lack of emphasis on a mastery orientation versus a system that you have to game to win with points. It's about grading and passing these grades and not failing. And so mastery orientations are something that take a while for students to really to change their vantage point of what is the purpose of assessment. Students, unfortunately, arrive in college in many classrooms appropriately thinking that this is sort of a game that you have to master and it's all about the points. Well, we're all guilty of fostering that, I think, flawed perspective. And a mastery-based approach is one where you're not competing with others, you're not using a curve, you are not emphasizing getting an A in the class, you're emphasizing and providing convincing opportunities for students to see the value of understanding for themselves, given that external rewards can be also a very problematic thing. So in essence, I think our biggest goal for assessment, what's worth assessing? Well, what's the context of assessment we want to foster at universities? And that is a mastery orientation that takes away the factors like competition, which reduce diversity, reduce a sense of belonging, increase alienation, and foster a view of assessment that's counter to what all of us, I think, want to achieve, which is a deeper understanding of the discipline.
Can I just, that's really great. And I just want to follow up and just say, yes, please, please, please don't curb your grades. Of all the practices that we could abandon that would improve equitable treatment of students, doing away with that curve would be the easiest thing that we could do. Absolutely, without doubt. And I am always astonished when I hear people, and I'm sorry if I'm offending you, but it's not a good practice. The bell curve was intended for random events, not people. And there's no reason to expect people to fall into a bell curve. So I feel very strongly about this. So I just wanted to follow up on that.
Great. Speaking of good practices, I want us to shift a little bit and think about what it is that makes an assessment good. What are the qualities we care about? Ross, why don't you start us off on this?
Yeah, good assessments. I mean, circling back to Melanie's point, a good assessment should be something that is important to assess. So I just want to mention that quickly. But the property of the assessment itself is a really important consideration. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that's still quite pervasive within higher education is that properties like validity and reliability refer to tests. And I think it's very important to move to the perspective that it's really the inferences we derive from test scores that can be valid. And so, for example, the epistemic distinction between observation and inference is something that most of us teach in our classes. I'm sure in chemistry, the distinction between observation and inference are key. Well, when we look at assessment data, we see an observation. Someone bubbled in a C, they bubbled in a D, they wrote this statement. That's an observation. We can draw many inferences from a single observation. My Zoom call could end right now and you could have 10 different inferences about why that happened. So the producing a good assessment is gathering evidence to support the inference derived from observations. And so the epistemic chain is very much like science itself, that is the chain of assessment evidence. It's how do we link observations and inferences with independent sources of evidence to confirm our inference is correct. Most assessments that we use in our classes lack any form of evidence to support our inferences. Concept inventories and other forms of assessments have moved the conversation forward to trying to gather stronger sources of evidence to make sure we know what we're claiming about the observations we gather. So validity and reliability are talked about a lot. They're not applied as much as they should be when we assess students in higher education. In fact, I think if most students knew that there's no evidence in many cases to support the claims we make about their abilities on their assessments, there could be a bit of a revolution. So I think the most important properties are validity and reliability, but many people misunderstand what that means. And so I think clarity, epistemic clarity on what we mean when we say validity and reliability is central to our communities moving forward to have a rich sense of that. So the answer in a nutshell is validity and reliability inferences, having strong sources of evidence supporting them. When we make a claim about the observations we gather, that is the score that we generate from a test, we know that that interpretation is correct.
Melanie, what are your thoughts?
Well, I would certainly support everything that Ross said. But I think we also, so the idea of assessment as an evidence-based argument, right? So we have to elicit evidence of whatever it is that we want. And so we have to be very clear about what it is that we want. We have to have some kind of theory of cognition, right? And you know, I don't think we need to put it up, but the assessment triangle that first appeared in Knowing What Students Know, the National Academy consensus report on assessment that was written 20 years ago now. But this idea that you need to have an idea of where you're going with this. And I think that has also been lost in the weeds. So for example, I think if you use concept inventories to measure learning, then your theory of cognition has to be different than if you think about learning as connecting, helping students connect the fragments and pieces and weave them together. So the knowledge in pieces perspective. So if you hold that perspective, then you would want to design assessments that would, well, one, see whether students have connected that knowledge, but also help them. Because I think that to me, a good assessment is a formative assessment, an assessment that can be used to help students not only get feedback on what they're doing, but also in the act of constructing their response, helps them become thoughtful and metacognitive about what they're actually doing. So helping students learn to write good explanations, good arguments, helping students to understand what makes a model, what are the components of a model, helping students to understand that a causal mechanism is something that can be used across disciplines to, once you understand how to do this, if we could all, you know, get on the same page, we might help students use these different approaches across the disciplines. And I think that would be, you know, and I think we're starting to do that. As Ross said, and you know, we have a project at MSU where we have across chemistry and biology, molecular biology and organismal biology, where we're looking at causal mechanistic reasoning across all three courses. And it's really interesting to have the different disciplinary aspects, to respect each discipline, but to understand how we can apply that kind of epistemic heuristic across not only different phenomena in one discipline, but across disciplines as well.
So I hear both of you talking about the kinds of inferences we can make from tasks that give us some evidence. But coming up with these tasks is not trivial. So I'm wondering if we can talk about the logistics a little bit. What are the kinds of evidence you gather to evaluate how a task is working, if the assessment is giving you the information you need? Whoever's bravest, go forth.
Okay, so I do have a slide here. So if you could put up the second slide of mine, just for a moment. There we go. So here, this is a kind of a way that we have adopted to design assessments. It was developed a while ago, but it's called evidence-centered design. And you start with exactly what is it you want them to know and how do you want them to know it, right? So this is kind of your theory of cognition as well, but it could be a really well-crafted performance expectation or learning performance. So it's not, you would hope it would be three-dimensional. It would have a core idea and a practice and a cross-cutting concept, but that's just me. You can design that however you want, depending on your theory of learning. But then you have to decide, well, what will I accept as evidence, right? What will I accept? You have to write down the evidence statements. Here we are. I would accept, they would have to say this and this and this and this and this. And then the next question you would ask yourself is, well, how would you analyze and interpret that evidence, you know? What are you going to do with that evidence? And all of this is iterative, of course. And when you've thought about these things, then design the task. What task will you design so that students will elicit the evidence that you believe is evidence that they are able to address this task? And it seems a little clunky and long-winded at first, but I think that it's once you get going, it can be simplified and you can kind of habitually get better at it, I think. And to me, the last part, the task that the students will perform, is actually the difficult part. You can actually, once you really sit down and think about it, yeah, I want students to be able to do this in this way, and I would accept as evidence this, this, and this. But then you have to design the task, and that for us has been more difficult. You know, you want the kind of Goldilocks prompt. If you ask too vague a question, you're not giving students enough guidance, and even good students who, you know, might hit it out of the ballpark, they're not used to answering questions like this and probably may not answer it. And if you make it too structured, then as we know, you're over hinting multiple choice, and you're back to multiple choice, which essentially we know tend to overestimate what students know and can do. So that's my 2 cents.
Ross, can you comment on this?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple really interesting things, I guess, to build on Melanie's points. And one of them is evidence-centered design is an extremely valuable framework for thinking about the articulation between these different domains. It's important to realize that there's actually several ways of approaching this task, and ECD is an excellent method. Alternative methods include using a construct validity framework, which is what the standards for educational and psychological testing typically emphasize. But they all involve these components that ECD emphasizes, which is that multiple forms of evidence, and this is another scientific principle that, that we use all the time in our science that relates to assessment. A single form of evidence is rarely robust enough to support a claim. To give you a practical example, we could ask students to just simply read a series of our test items and tell us, what do you think this is saying? And oftentimes we find that already our inference that students understand the question is not supported. So there's also, as many of us are probably familiar with, think alouds, basically explaining what you're thinking about as you answer the question. And in many cases, these diverse forms of evidence don't always even coalesce into a coherent evidence-based perspective on student thinking. It can be ambiguous, which requires a reformulation of tasks, a reassessment of the inferences we're drawing. And so perhaps the take-home point is diverse forms of evidence are very valuable in understanding how students are approaching, answering, thinking about particular tasks. A second concern that has been documented for a half century now is the features of tasks that we give students strongly influence the type of information that they draw out from students. In the life sciences in particular, it's not a well-investigated area, but the diversity of life itself is an aspect of the natural world that can strongly impact our inferences about what students know and what they don't know. Plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, individual groups, the phenotypic features of living systems, whether they're functional, whether they're behavioral, whether they are static, all of this impacts the inferences we make. And so often as educators, we have fooled ourselves about what we think students know because of these task features. And so, and this has been documented in chemistry and physics and many other fields of science. And so the task development, as Melanie said, is a big challenge. And the generality of our inferences based on these task features are not a trivial aspect.
Thank you. I want to pause here and hear a little bit from our attendees. We have a question from Natalia, so I'm unmuting you, Natalia. So you should be good to talk if you want to ask your question. Or not. All right. Well, can I hear from anyone else some of y'all's questions about thinking about designing these tasks and designing good assessments? Okay, Jill, I'm allowing you to talk.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, Ross. Hi, Melanie. It's good to see you guys again. So my question is, we are dealing with a lot of, going back to assessment tasks and equity, we are going to have some students that have to be remote and some students that will be in person and some classes will be hybrid. So what sorts of pitfalls have you foreseen that we could try to avoid? I know I'm asking like for the world right now, but what can we actually do to try to keep these tasks as equitable as possible as we try to navigate not only the content, but also just the very forms in which we are teaching this year.
Thank you for that question, Jill.
I notice we're rushing to answer it. So we're all struggling with this. And I don't have a good answer for you. What I will say is that we use online learning system. It's called Be Socratic, that allows us to have students write and draw, construct models and explanations and arguments. And we use it whether we are in person or whether we're online. So for us, when the transition was made, that particular aspect it didn't change. I know we have later on in the webinar about how do we adapt assessments to online and remote environments, but I think from what I know, and I am not an expert on this, so let me just be the first to say that, but asking these kinds of formative assessments on a regular basis, you know, at least twice a week, very low stakes, doing away with the high stakes assessments, the assessments that cause such anxiety in students. And I know we had a lot of questions about cheating, but I'm not, I think if we can help students understand that what we're asking them to do is to help them learn to achieve a certain mastery rather than business as usual, and we're going to give you a 50-item multiple choice test, I think can go a long way to not only lowering the anxiety of students, but also making the experience more equitable, regardless of whether they're in person or online.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty important question, and I think I would agree. I don't have the expertise to provide a very robust evidence-based answer, but some forms of evidence we do know are central in online and non-online environments is exactly as Melanie said, that for students to gauge where they are at, emphasizing a mastery approach to learning and providing lots of opportunities to self-assess and reflect on what one needs to know, and in kind of to foster a more metacognitive approach to the whole learning apparatus is central to this. The tasks themselves, I am quite worried about, because I use a lot of technology as well, and I'm very worried about the implementation of a lot of the things we typically do because of equity and access. And I don't have answers to how this is going to be impacting student success, but I'm just with bandwidth issues, collaboration, using these external digital tools. I think we all have a lot of, we need to reflect much more deeply on the consequences of everything we're doing for these contexts.
We'll return to this question a little bit too at the end if we have time. I'm hoping we can shift to a discussion of what kinds of assessments are there? What do different kinds of assessments have to offer? And I'm hoping we can make this discussion very practical. Again, whoever's bravest.
Okay. So, of course, it depends what you mean by alternative, of course. And again, I'm going to go back to this idea of formative assessments rather than low stakes. Peer teaching and learning, having students work together. We teach huge sections, so I have a 300 seater organic class. But we do have recitations where they can work in groups together. I have had students do video projects on an organic chemical of their choosing that emphasizes structure properties. Open book exams, group exams, portfolios, retaking the exam until as a group, writing summaries, explanation, multiple choice plus explanation, poems. I've had students write poems. They like that. They're far more poetic than I am, it turns out. We have students write letters about how to do things, to teach other students, and evaluate and respond to other students' work, those kinds of things. We do all the time, I would say. And my plan is to make them a larger part of the course grade. So to expand those opportunities and to diminish the testing, that the traditional testing that we've more usually relied on. Is that what you meant by practical? Does that help? Okay.
Ross, what kinds of assessment methods have you dealt with and used?
Well, certainly not the diversity of ones Melanie mentioned. That was a great review. Some other things people have done and include, for example, building Wikipedia pages, and things that I've done as well is having students actually explore their natural environment, even within their home. There's incredible biodiversity within every person's, whether it's an apartment, a dorm room, or a home. The living world is on us, around us, and unavoidable. And it's often surprising to students, and given the ubiquity of cell phones and other things, students are documenting all kinds of fascinating life forms and asking questions and seeing their environment in a different way. So those maybe could be added to that excellent list of a lot of great things that many of us have used too.
So I'm going to go off script a tiny bit. Hannah Sevian taught me the value of eliciting information from people via asking them to tell stories. So I'm wondering if each of you could tell me a story about an assessment that you have developed that posed challenges.
Okay. So what do you mean by challenges? Well, I'll tell you a story and then you can tell me.
Okay.
So a long time ago, when I first started, I used to incorporate writing assignments into my courses very early on. This was in the early 90s. And it was a writing to learn. I was all in. And I came up with this assignment, which was, and I was teaching a non-science majors course, and it was called, I can't remember what it was called, but it was not for science majors, but I asked them, what would life be like if water were a linear molecule? Because they were always drawing water, linear. And their answers were wonderful. I mean, they were so wonderful. They wrote, a science fiction essay about what life would be like, if water molecules didn't stick together because they were linear and therefore they weren't polar. And they got it, and it was just great. And the first time I did that was excellent. And I did it again, and then I did it with the big chem major, the science majors chemistry course. And they could draw a picture if they wanted, or they could write a poem or write. And about 30% of the class wrote exactly the same thing. They wrote that if water were linear, water striders would not be able to walk on the water because there would be no surface tension. And sure enough, Google had captured it. And this was still in the way early days. And I was so disappointed, you know, and so this is not a story with a happy ending. It was a challenge and I've never used it again because because I don't want to hear what Google has to say about it. So maybe someone can help me with that.
That's pretty good, actually. I don't know if I won that amusing, but certainly doing a lot of assessments. I mean, almost every assessment I've ever worked on developing has been an incredible challenge. Just from, I guess, the take-home message. I don't know if it's a story or if it's a fable. Is that every time you think you may understand how students are thinking, it's much more complicated than you think. And I've had very large teams of researchers working on projects where everybody was convinced what students would think and how they thought about something. And many, many meetings we'd be sitting at student responses in silence because everyone was just dumbfounded by how they had misunderstood the way students were thinking and approaching problems. And it's a very humbling experience. That it circles back to my earlier point that these multiple forms of evidence to inform our inferences about what we think is going on in terms of learning, the inferences we make about how we think we're impacting students. So many times we have been very wrong, and I think everyone has been very dedicated and thought very deeply, but we are mistaken many times. And that the need to be humble as we approach the assessment, the process of articulating evidence and inference, being humble about what we think we understand is perhaps the most important lesson. So I don't know if it's a story or what it is, but that's my point.
It had a nice moral. So I want to loop back around to any last considerations about applying so many of the things you all have discussed to remote learning. And then I want to open it up for some broader questions from our attendees. So be thinking about good questions, attendees. And then, Melanie, if we can go back to you, and if you could just talk a little bit more about some of the considerations in taking these assessments online.
Well, again, the obvious, you know, the elephant in the room is that students are going to collaborate. When we asked for questions, there were a lot of questions about that. And I think that my hope, my goal, and it seemed to work reasonably well in the spring, is that by lowering the stakes, by providing them with a lot of opportunities to earn credit towards passing the course and getting a reasonable grade because it's organic chemistry. I try to make it very clear what the stakes are, and the homework, we don't grade the homework. They do it, so there are 300 students and they do these writing and drawing and all this stuff twice a week at least, and so they're very used to it, and we don't grade it, and we tell them we're going to look at it sometimes, but we're not going to grade it. You get credit for doing it. And The interesting thing is, when we started doing this, I was really worried. I thought, oh, this is going to be a disaster. But it turns out it isn't. And I think it has to do with the culture that you set at the beginning and the explanations that you give to students. Obviously, you know, I'm not saying that all 2,500 students in the Gen Chem program at MSU are, you know, happily doing a sterling homework effort, but most of them are. I would say 90% of them are. And when we've analyzed these homeworks and looked at the similar questions on a summative assessment, there's not that much difference in the effort. And so I would say, think about, try to stop being a sorter, become a gardener, not a weeder, and don't worry about sorting out the students for whatever reason who don't appear to be doing well. In fact, reach out to them because they've probably got all kinds of issues going on. So I think, you know, our best bet is to be kinder and to keep the stakes low, but expect students to do the work. I'm not saying that we should, you know, just throw it all out and give them some Mickey Mouse stuff. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying have high expectations, but low stakes. Maybe that's my mantra there in the sentence.
Ross, can you comment on some of the considerations you're making?
Yeah, I think the principle that Melanie talked about many more low stakes assessments is absolutely central. Most conversations about online assessment that I've experienced tend to be focused on the issue of cheating. And by minimizing the number of very few high stakes tests, the amount of cheating appears to go down. And so that's also tied to this notion of a mastery orientation for students. And that is something that I have been working on. It's very difficult. One of the classes I oversee, for example, this fall has 750 students. And so a mastery orientation, what it means is we don't really care if on Tuesday night taking this quiz, you didn't get it. What we mean is we want you to understand this, and we're going to work with you as many times as possible to help you succeed. Now that requires different assessment systems, different technologies, and we've done that with our practice assessments for many years, and students really like the opportunity because our actions match our assessments. Our goals match our assessments. We want you to master this material. We're going to give you lots of opportunities. So in online environments, the question is, are we going to have multiple opportunities for our low stakes assessments? So if a student does not understand something, if they have challenges with it, if we truly believe in a mastery orientation, are we going to be altering our course to provide those multiple opportunities? So that's something that we're really trying to work towards this fall, is to provide a more convincing argument to students that we really believe in this approach to their learning, and that our assessment practices really mirror that. And so that's something that we're trying to work towards in the online environment.
Awesome, thank you. So I want to open the floor to some questions from our participants, and these can be about all the points we've touched on today. And to start us off, I'm going to put Jack on the spot to ask his question that was posed in the chat in real life. Would that be okay, Jack? Raise your hand if you mean yes. All right.
All right, can you guys hear me? Oh, yep, okay. Hey, Melanie. Hi, Ross. So yeah, I put in the chat a while ago when you guys were talking about the automated analysis. So my understanding of the machine learning is that there's a lot of front loading of the data and the analysis to be able to use something like that. Can you guys comment on the state of that? I know I talked with Mark many years ago about trying to build something along those lines, and that was my perception of the ability to alter questions becomes hard because of the front loading. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, using machine learning methods, I mean, there's different kind of frameworks for machine learning. There's supervised, unsupervised, and semi-supervised machine learning. And so a lot of the approaches that the ACER project has taken and many other things is supervised machine learning, which all that means is you're giving the computer lots of information about how the students did, and you're giving them their answers, and it's building a model that's then tested about how students think. Now, of course, AI has developed a lot in the past 10 years since I started doing machine learning stuff. And I'm hopeful that in the future we can move away from the laborious front loading, exactly as you said, in this process. But all of us probably in this webinar, if there's even anybody there, probably grades papers. And if as a community, we all collected all of our graded papers, we would have a huge database of information that could be used to build tons of machine learning models. What we've done as a field in chemistry and bio is we've essentially taken all the data that everyone in Silicon Valley has made millions of dollars off of, which is information. And we have thrown it away, we have recycled it. And so one thing that has frustrated me over the past decade working on this is that if we actually, as educators, looked at our scored papers as a source of data that has value and concatenated and leveraged that information, our field could have moved ahead much, much, much faster. But unlike Silicon Valley and others, we did not see the potential of the data that we had, and we did not use it. And so the front loading is largely done now on new items and new things, whereas I know colleagues have done fantastic assessments over the years, but they have put it in the recycle bin at the end of a few years.
I'm going to keep putting people on the spot. Colleen, you've mentioned a few times thinking about the curve in your context. Could you ask that question for us to be able to have a discussion about it? Raise your hand if you're open. All right.
All right. Thanks a lot, Alina. Yeah, my question, it came up earlier in the session when Melanie, you were talking about no one should curve grades, and I 100% agree. But you know, I'm at a large university, and I'm often teaching Gen Chem of just one section of a huge, like 2,000 person general enrollment service class, and we're not in an aligned curriculum. We have a lot of academic freedom between sections, and so we curve as a way to make the sections more, I'm going to use the word equitable, knowing that I'm using it in an inappropriate way, but just to kind of even out the differences between classes. And so what should we do in a situation like that when we don't have an existing aligned curriculum? And we might in the future someday have one in which we have learning goals and assessments that are aligned, but we don't have it now. How do we get away from curving?
Well, there's no good answer to that, is there?
Yeah.
And you know, I think people overplay academic freedom sometimes. I teach at a large university, and we have 2,500 students in our Gen Chem program, and we don't curve our grades. And in fact, when we transitioned to the transformed curriculum, what we found was that the grades went up, well, partly because of grade impact. I don't think they curved them before, but the grades went up, the DWF rate went down. So we pass now more than 700 students a year more who have a grade of C or better that can move on to the next course. I know I'm not answering your question. I'm trying to persuade you to change what you're doing. And those students are not failing when they go on. They're carrying on. They do just fine in organic chemistry. They're just fine. And I think that we have to, this experience that students have when they first come to university has to be a good one. You know, if we put them into courses that are punitive, that are curved, that where they're competing against other people, it's a huge problem. And I know I'm not answering the question, and I don't have a good answer for it because you're in between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Ross, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I agree. It's time to become an activist and unify your course to have those objectives, as Melanie has discussed, which requires a lot of energy and political savvy, but is worth it. When we talk about equity and diversity issues, curving is one of the factors that really in competition negatively impacts you know, particular underrepresented minorities and others, first generation students. It's alienating. It harms what we want to do.
Awesome. Abdi, I saw your hand up for a short second. Was that real? All right. You should be good to go.
Hi, Melanie and Ross. So I'm in a department of biology and we don't curve. But as Melanie noted, often what happens is when you don't curve, you have students who end up with larger grades because we're using multiple different ways of assessment, diverse ways of assessments. But it's in a lower division course. And often what we would hear from the faculty who are teaching the upper division courses is your grades are inflated. They think you're dealing with inflation. So how do you respond to folks who think that if you're not using high stakes exam all the time, in essence, what you're doing is inflating the grades?
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, and I'm not surprised. It's a pity that people are still sticking to this idea that we have to sort students out. That's not what we're here for. We're here to educate them. And my suggestion is to show your colleagues what your students can do, because they might be surprised. We have had similar issues, and one of the things that we did was we asked upper level classes to answer a question that we give in Gen Chem about bond energies. You know, the old chestnut about bond energies. Now our students can handle it pretty well. Well, it turns out, of course, that students in an upper level PChem course still are stuck on bond breaking releases energy. And so that was a huge surprise, I think, to faculty. So, you know, find some artifacts of things that students in your class have done and you know, talk it up, because we have to overcome, I truly believe we have to overcome this notion that only the true, the real men get to be chemists or biologists or whatever, right? We're here to educate everybody, and everybody can learn. And there are, you know, Not everybody will, but we certainly want to give everybody an opportunity. So that's my best advice.
Thank you for that question. Jack, I went ahead and permitted talking because I saw your hand up.
All right, I get a second go for a differently framed question. So thus far, everything has been focused on content-based assessments, which I think is great, and there's a huge need for it. But can you comment on whether you think other types of things you would recommend for people to be assessing in their classes? I've heard a lot about belonging and inclusion types of things, certainly aspects of motivation or engagement. What are your thoughts about those types of assessments as well as the content-based things? And it may be that your comment is those are only applicable for research projects.
Oh, to start with the last thing you said, I would personally disagree with that. I think many instructors are quite surprised when they find that the students do not perceive them to have attributes that they're really working quite hard to project. For example, in terms of growth mindset, we know that the student perceptions of faculty, whether they think that you are either a chemistry person or you are not, you've got the goods. Growth mindset is an important measure that should be considered. Do your students think that you think that they could actually grow and be successful in the field? That's pretty important. And the same is true of belongingness within the classroom, perhaps to a lesser extent than growth mindset. Certainly STEM identity. So there are many issues that can be very, very valuable if we are to adopt a data-driven culture as educators. The diversity of data, again, this is perhaps I'm beating a dead horse here, but the diversity of data, the more information you have, the better decisions you can typically make. Not always. More data can be a flood, a nightmare. But all of these psychosocial indicators that you've indicated in your question, I can speak personally, have certainly altered how I think about how students perceive me, and colleagues who I know are very invested in equity and diversity would have students say the opposite due to misperceptions. And there are huge misperceptions about us from our students, and we need to have data. I mean, many scientists may not be the most social creatures. I don't know if that's a stereotype or not, but having insights into the images we project to students can sometimes be quite surprising to us. And I think these assessments could move things in a positive direction in chemistry and biology.
Thank you. Renee, I have you unpermitted.
Yes. So on this same theme, I think, or vein, is also thinking about the connection between the assessments and the feedback we give to students. So if you're looking at improving mastery, I would say in most cases we do a poor job of actually giving students anything that's actionable feedback to improve performance or build skills in either content knowledge, especially in any of the practices. So some thoughts about ways to think more about how we also provide students feedback and not just instructors.
So this is a good question, Renee. And it's especially problematic for those of us who are teaching these large enrollment courses. How do you give students, hundreds of students, feedback on what are rather very complex things that we're asking them to do? And I think we've mastered the art of giving feedback on trivial questions, on learning management systems, multiple choice. You can program in feedback. And if you've ever seen a student doing this until they get it right, so we don't do that. We can't give feedback to everybody on everything, but what we do is we give students feedback in the class. So we choose anonymized student homework examples and talk about them. And have the class evaluate and critique what's going on there, working groups, and sometimes they do it in recitation, but always in the class, to think about what was meant, what the question was asking, which of these different responses actually answer the question, which, you know, and typically we choose ones that all answer the question, but they have very different levels of reflection in the answer. And then we give them the opportunity to redo the question just for review. And you know, I wish we had more individualized feedback that we could give. I mean, we can give feedback on student graph drawing and simple diagram kinds of things in our system, but for the most part, writing everyday complex arguments and explanations and drawing models, students have to get engaged with that process as well. I think it's a two-way street. I don't think that we get, here's your feedback, and now and actually the research on that is, here's your feedback, oh, thank you, and then I don't read it. We just were looking at research on that the other day. So we have to be careful about how we give feedback. But yeah, it's difficult for us, certainly us with large classes.
So, Mary, you've asked a question in the chat now that I would love to hear asked in real life. Do you mind raising your hand? If not, I'm going to ask the question because I think it's a good one. The question was, should instructors collect and record scores by student by question and then run IRT on the results to see how well the exams match students' abilities?
Well, I'll say you could do that. You can do many things, but that may not be the most valuable use of your time. I think, again, exploring some of the student answers themselves to questions and thinking about the quality of the questions themselves. What does this tell me about the student thinking? How is this a question that is important for us to know as faculty as the student moves forward in a program? So I think psychometric methodologies are extremely important, but they have limitations. You have to, the way I look at it, for better or for worse, is the cost-benefit analysis. What insights will I glean potentially from looking in detail at these student responses, and maybe spending the time, instead of running an IRT model, actually trying to get some more information about what students thought the questions meant. Explain, why did you choose that answer? And so I think there's a cost benefit that has to be played out relating to what we're going to do with the information we have. And I'm a huge IRT fan, so I don't say that lightly.
Awesome. Okay, Jamie, I saw your hand raised and I encourage you to raise it again if you have a question. Until then, I'm going to have Sam share his question.
Sure, thanks. Hi, Melanie. Hi, Ross. You both alluded to the fact that a lot of work goes into designing good assessments. And so I'm wondering your thoughts on advantages and disadvantages to some entity or governing body in our disciplines mass producing assessments to lighten the load, even if said entities were following the things you were espousing, like core idea-centered and evidence-centered design? Or is there still use for institutional contextualization in assessments?
Well, I think both. I think it would be wonderful if we had really well-designed assessments that could assess, that were polytomous, so that they were, different levels of understanding, perhaps, rather than yes, no. I think that would be wonderful. But I also think that we shouldn't outsource our assessments to other people, because it is, as Ross alluded to, when you look at what students write and draw, it's so illuminating. So I think there's room for both of these, but I do think that there is room for all of us to move along the spectrum, if you like. I'm not advocating that we ask every assessment has to be, crafted exquisitely, taking 3 months, because that's ridiculous. Nobody's going to do that. But it gets easier to write these kinds of assessments, and they're so illuminating. They're so, illuminating, I guess is the best word.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly that I think it's a great question, and we need the quality. We have to have some assessments that we know are very robust, and we can really, when we get scores, we know what they mean, and that's not a trivial task. But I completely agree with Melanie that in terms of thinking about faculty development, it takes a long time for a biologist or a chemist to begin to engage with student answers and begin to think about student thinking in a way that can be transformative for instruction and can be transformative for what we're trying to do at universities. And so the faculty development piece of and professional learning opportunities for faculty is something I really want to, I agree with that very much, with that point that Melanie made.
So Jamie, let's have you close us out with your question.
Okay, thank you both so much for this wonderful panel. I have been toying with the idea of how to incorporate oral exam questions in a video capture kind of format, going from a flipped classroom book that talked about, how to set up an oral exam, and then having a recent discussion, hearing that, video capture is probably the best way to do it as far as, managing your time goes. And so the idea with those would be that you had a few questions that students were able to see beforehand at, they might be asked to answer, 2 of these 5 questions or something like that. And if it would, trying to solve the Chegg problem of, squashing your very good question, and having a way of constantly generating good questions. Is there any way that we can kind of leverage students' exposure to the science and engineering practices in grade school to kind of ask them at, in the course of covering chapters, maybe as note takers or something? I'm going to do it for a small class, but, just in a regular way to ask them to generate those types of questions where they would be putting their knowledge into practice, and you give them a rubric for, have you seen enough of these 3D type assessment questions that you could kind of generate a rubric that you could share with students? Or do you think that is kind of asking too much of students, in the course of covering the chapter, right before their test?
So we have done something. We didn't ask students to generate the question, but what we did was we asked students to generate the rubric, and then we gave them we gave them the answer to the question, and they would score that. And then they scored anonymous answers, and they had to give feedback. And that was really very instructive. This was something that they had not done before, it was clear. But I don't know about designing the question. I mean, it's a testable question. Go for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was very helpful.
Thank you for that question, Jamie, and right on time. Thank you so much, Melanie and Ross, for being here and sharing your thoughts on this. And to everyone who attended, we will post this recording. So thank you all so much.